So I think we've just hit 2 o'clock, so we'll get
Mhm.
started. So as some of you may have seen, I popped up a little survey in my Instagram over the last week just to see of vegans who is actually supplementing vitamin B12 and who is feeling confident that they know what supplement to take if they're taking a supplement. And what I noticed was that there was a lot of confusion and a lot of people weren't feeling confident in whether they should take a supplement, and if so, what sort of supplement to take. So Luke and I were having a bit of a conversation following the results from this survey, and
Yeah.
we thought, yeah, we thought what better way to sort of address this than jump on a live and have a conversation about it. So for those of you who maybe are not familiar with Luke. He's an amazing doctor and GP based in Wellington. I've worked with him a bit through Doctors for Nutrition. So he's the New Zealand director of Doctors for Nutrition, which is a registered charity, and it's an organisation aimed at bringing nutrition back to healthcare. So we've sort of met through that, but Luke has such an amazing wealth of knowledge and experience. Not only is he a GP, he's also done additional training in lifestyle medicine and also completed a master's in psychology. So we're really lucky to have Luke along today. He's also done research on plant-based diets and helped hundreds of people improve their health through plant-based diets. So I thought he's the perfect person to have on today to have a conversation about vegan diets and vitamin B12. Yeah, was there anything else you'd like to add, Luke?
No, that was pretty good. Thank you. I'm flattered.
No, it's a real honour to have you here. So I just thought I would get started by, yeah, maybe we can have a chat a little bit about what vitamin B12 is and
Yeah,
why it's important.
sure. So vitamin B12 obviously is a vitamin, and it contains the mineral cobalt. And apparently vitamin B12 has the largest and most complicated molecular structure of all the vitamins. And it was also, another fun fact, it's the most recently discovered vitamin. Now, it's really important for the healthy functioning of our nervous system, particularly because it's involved in the production and maintenance of the myelin sheaths that go around our nerve fibers. And it's also super important because it's involved in DNA synthesis. So because of that, one of the things that it's really important in as well is our red blood cell production. And it's also involved with a bunch of other vitamins in making the macronutrients that we consume into energy that the body can use. So you start to get an idea. Obviously, all the vitamins and minerals are important, but you start to get a bit of an idea of why vitamin B12 might be something really, really important for us to be considering, particularly those of us that are on plant-based dietary patterns.
Yeah, like it has such a variety in terms of its purpose within the body. So yeah,
Yeah,
when covering those many different aspects of our health, yeah, really key to make sure that we're getting enough of them in our diet. Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
So I guess to sort of break that down
Mm.
into sort of what people might experience, like what would you say are the symptoms of or signs or symptoms that people may experience if they are deficient in vitamin B12?
Yeah, so basically you can think about what we've just talked about and think about those systems of the body that might be involved, so the nervous system and obviously the blood as well. And so oftentimes the first symptoms that people get of deficiency are of an anemia. So the most common anemia, obviously, that people will be familiar with is an iron deficiency anemia. So you'll get very similar symptoms to that. So like a fatigue, maybe just sort of like a feeling of listlessness, just tiredness. And that's oftentimes one of the first symptoms that people will get. Obviously, for the nervous system involvement as well, you might get some tingling in your hands and feet early on. And then that can progress into much more serious things, like even sort of like a mild depression, and all the way to you can actually get a dementia from it, and nervous system damage that's irreversible. Other symptoms that you might experience, again, because of the DNA synthesis function of it, are going to be, you can get mouth ulcers, you might have a sore tongue, and even hair loss. So there's really quite a wide variety of things that you might experience. And yeah, I guess one of the things that you want to do is you really want to prevent this happening in the first place, because a lot of these effects you probably won't get until it's quite late on in the piece, and potentially there's already been some damage done.
That's so true. Yeah, so I guess in terms of picking these things up, like a lot of those things you described, they're really quite generic symptoms. Like
Yeah,
how
exactly.
often you come home at the end of the week and thought, I feel tired.
Yeah, it's super vague, right? And I
Yeah.
suppose from a medical perspective as well, if your doctor doesn't realize that you're, you know, plant-based or whatever, I'll often get people come in and say, oh, I think my iron levels are low because I feel fatigued, and so, you know, I check the iron levels. But if your doctor doesn't realize that you're plant-based, then they may not realize that it could also be a B12 deficiency that's causing those exact same symptoms, and may not test for it. So although they should be testing a full blood count at the same time. And what you'd see is what we call a macrocytic anemia, where the blood cells are actually larger, but there's less of them. So that looks quite different to what you'd see with an iron deficiency anemia, where the cells are smaller and there's less of them.
Yeah. Do you mind if I might just take us back a step there as well?
Mm.
A slight tangent, but do you recommend talking like in detail with your doctors about following a plant-based diet? Because I've heard a lot of people get quite a lot of resistance from healthcare professionals. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that I've heard a lot of people experience, and that's one of the reasons that I have people that come to me specifically, because they know they're not going to get that kind of approach to things. And the issue is that, you know, even as far as thinking about B12 and plant-based diets generally, is that there's just not that much familiarity with it at the moment, within the medical profession, because it's kind of a new thing that a lot of people are actually doing this. So I think it's always worth having a talk to your GP about it, and then if they're not supportive, then there's various ways that you can go about that. And I'd say, you know, if you can, consider getting someone who's a bit more open-minded, you know, or something else you can do as well is, like, so I'll just plug Doctors for Nutrition's resources. We have some on the website that you could actually get sent to them, or offer them to get for them to look at as well, so that they can learn a bit more about plant-based eating patterns and how they can be very helpful, in fact, and useful for people. So
That's a really good point, actually. And a really good way of sort of addressing the root cause of the problem there as well, because we know that plant-based diets are great for health, and rather than sort of avoiding the difficult conversation with your healthcare professional, if you can actually, if you're feeling bold enough to have that conversation and send them some research, like Doctors for Nutrition, which we're both part of, is a really great resource for that. All of the resources are done by healthcare professionals, and you can flick them through to your GP or any other healthcare professional as well, just
exactly.
To sort of outline that. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I'd be really surprised. Like, I think most of them are going to be very, you know, supportive and interested, and so a lot of the time it's kind of up to us to explain about things, and just to you know, have that conversation with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Luke and I were actually lucky enough to attend the
Oh,
GP
yeah.
conference about a year ago, not the most recent one.
Yeah.
And we spoke with lots of GPs across New Zealand, and I think what really stood out from that event was actually that there's so much growing interest in plant-based diets, and I think we were probably one of the most popular stalls there. We had big crowds of GPs all wanting to actually learn more about plant-based diets. So I do think the tide is turning on this. And I think, yeah, hopefully very soon gone will be the days of healthcare professionals discouraging plant-based diets. So
yeah,
I think there has been a massive change in the tide there. Would you agree?
yeah, no, definitely. And I think bringing it back to the B12 thing as well is that really, when you think about a plant-based diet, this is really the only way that you can, there's obviously nutritional considerations, but B12 is the absolute must that you have to get right. And when you see those, every now and then there'll be a story in the paper about, or in the media about a child usually who hasn't done well with a plant-based diet, and that there can be tragic consequences of that. And I know that that's happened in New Zealand before too. So really what we need to be doing is, as part of our kind of advocacy, I suppose, is showing health professionals that this can be a very healthy way of doing things. And so you don't want to be that person that gets health, basically the only negative health consequence that's possible with a plant-based eating pattern is arguably is becoming B12 deficient. So you just don't want to be that person that's letting the rest of the team down.
That's so true. And a really good way of putting it. Yeah. Yeah. I guess just to go back a step as well. So when it comes to vitamin B12, if you're not vegan, you may get vitamin B12 through dairy and eggs and a bit of meat as well. And a lot of the B12 that is actually present in those foods is coming because the animals are supplemented it too. It's not all natural B12. So I think that's really important to bear in mind, because I think we're quite quick to sort of criticize the fact that we need B12 supplements, but when we actually think about our food system as a whole, aren't we better off cutting out the middleman?
Yeah, exactly. It's the bacteria in the soil that, and obviously in the stomachs of ruminant animals as well, that have sort of a symbiotic relationship that create the B12. So that's where it's coming from most of the time. And yeah, especially in areas where there's not enough cobalt in the soil, for example, then the animals will need to be supplemented B12 as well. So yeah, I don't think it's said anything negative about a plant-based diet or eating pattern that you need to supplement B12, or you need to find a different way of getting it one way or another.
Yeah, absolutely. So that maybe I should have given a bit of a spoiler there, but both Luke and I support vitamin B12 supplementation for people who are following a strict vegan diet, which you may have guessed from some of the messaging before the talk. And I personally recommend supplements regardless of what your blood levels are showing, but certainly monitoring your blood levels is really important as well. When it comes to monitoring your B12 levels, it's a simple blood test, and I believe it's free if you get it ordered by your GP. Luke, would you be able to tell us a little bit about the vitamin B12 blood test?
Yeah, the interesting thing about the vitamin B12 blood test is it's actually a pretty horrible test. It's not a particularly useful one. So it's tricky. So basically it measures the amount of B12 in your blood, and that doesn't, it can still look okay. And the reference range, I think, goes from somewhere about 180 or so, maybe a little bit lower, don't quote me on that, as being considered normal. And just because of the sort of issues involved with that test, anywhere between that lower end of the reference range to about 300 or so is considered indeterminate. So you actually don't know whether you're B12 sufficient within that lower end of the range. And most GPs don't know that. I didn't know that until relatively recently. And so yours probably won't. And so you kind of need to be checking that for yourself. And what I say to people is that, and I can't remember the research paper that I got it from, but if you're getting over about 360 on that standard test, then you should be all right. If it's super important that you know for sure whether you're deficient or not, then there is a test called the MMA test, which stands for methylmalonic acid or something. And that's, earlier I talked about sort of how B12 is important in sort of various processes, metabolic processes, I guess, in the body. And that's the levels of that metabolite in the blood or acid or whatever it is will indicate whether there's actually sufficient B12 there. So the combination of those two tests will be the optimal. Now, the problem with this, again, comes back to what I was saying earlier as well about this kind of people being plant-based and eating this way, and even like B12 probably being something that doctors don't know a whole lot about. That test actually isn't accessible to GPs. So you have to be a specialist to be able to order that test, and we don't count as specialists, and you can't actually, in New Zealand at least, go and just say to your GP, can you order this MMA test for me? So that's somewhere where medicine sort of isn't caught up to probably what we should be doing for people, particularly people who are plant-based. And that's just an issue that's there. So I'm just pointing that out. So definitely if you're having symptoms that are consistent with B12 deficiency and your GP has done the B12 test, then it's worth being an advocate for yourself and just saying, hey, look, can you get someone to do this other test? I've seen neurologists do it before, so it certainly can be ordered by a specialist, and so your GP might be able to find some way of getting you that test if you've got symptoms and the serum B12 test is saying everything's okay. But yeah, so aiming for like above 360 or so is a really good idea. And I agree as well, Fuchsia, is like, if you're actually supplementing and you're supplementing the right kinds of amounts and things, I think having the test is kind of a useful thing to do to kind of get an idea as to whether you're doing that regularly enough. One of the issues with that, of course, is that we have stores of B12. And so if you've only recently become plant-based, then in theory you could be supplementing not enough, but your stores are keeping you at the right level. So it gets complex. So it is worth sort of regularly checking that. And if it's staying about the right level, then, and you're supplementing, then chances are, you can probably leave it at that.
On that note, yeah, vitamin B12 can be stored in your liver for up to 3 years. So I have seen some conversations around, like if you're new to a plant-based diet, you don't need to worry about vitamin B12 supplementation. But I think this is a really problematic viewpoint, simply because most people don't necessarily go from eating a completely like Western diet straight to a full plant-based diet. Usually there's a bit of a progression. I can certainly say that was the case for me, and I'd been vegetarian for most of my life and then sort of went vegan. So there are still risks of being low in vitamin B12 if you have sort of been following a vegetarian diet as well. And I think it's also something that the consequences of this, of being deficient, are just so huge that why would you not want to sort of avoid that at all costs and start good habits early?
Yeah, exactly. And it seems like it can be a lot quicker than we've thought originally. Like I've just read a paper the other day that said that, so it can happen a lot more quickly. For kids, it's especially important, especially infants, because they have no stores basically, so they will go deficient like right away.
Especially if there's been any issues with supplementation during pregnancy and breastfeeding as well. So when you're pregnant or breastfeeding, your requirements for B12 actually go up. So you will actually need a bit more as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Oh, and the other thing too is that apparently, it's not even just an issue necessarily for people who are plant-based, and there can be other reasons that you're not absorbing B12 well as well. And I just learned today actually that apparently the Institute of Medicine in the States, for people that are over the age of 50, says that they should actually be getting most of their B12 from supplements or fortified foods, because as we get older, well, Fuchsia, you'll probably be able to explain it better than I can, but it's to do with the protein needs to be
Yeah,
digested well and things for you to access the B12.
yeah.
So,
Especially vitamin B12 is typically complexed or attached to a protein. So when you eat it from animal sources, you are dependent on the acid in your stomach to actually separate that bond and to absorb that B12. And as we get older, the strength of the acid in our stomach goes down as we age, and so that process becomes harder and harder. And yeah, I was actually reading the same information, where for people over 50 years old, they recommend that about half of their B12 should be coming from supplemental sources, so either
yeah.
fortified foods or taking a tablet. And with such serious consequences of being deficient, yeah, we do need to be quite precautionary around this.
Yeah.
And I guess on the flip side, are you aware of any adverse effects of taking vitamin B12 supplements?
No, apparently, like in high doses, some people can have breakouts with acne or rosacea, but yeah, it's rare, and you'd know about it, and so you'd usually probably see that in people who are getting the injection, for example, which is a huge. I forget how many thousand units it is, but it's massive. So you get this huge amount of B12 in the system at once. And some people need to have the injection. That's why it's funded, because they have a condition called pernicious anemia, where they actually can't absorb the B12 properly. So that's why that's funded. But unfortunately, you can't get a prescription from your GP for B12, which again I think is where we're really lagging. For people who are plant-based, that should be something that you're able to access from your GP. It should be something that Pharmac funds. I'd like to see that happen.
Yeah, I think especially as conversations like this are growing, and we're seeing more and more people adopt a plant-based diet, I think, yeah, we should definitely be able to push for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think, yeah, vitamin B12 is absolutely critical. And like when you look at sort of, okay, you might end up with some skin issues versus like nerve damage, and those sorts of consequences, brain fog, all of that. Yeah, it's sort of the scales are definitely tipping in one direction.
Yeah, yeah. And something interesting I just read as well was that apparently multivitamins can be an issue. So if it's in a multivitamin, one, you usually see that it's usually not enough, that it's actually providing. But two, apparently when you've got all those other vitamins at once, so this is something I didn't know. So I'm learning a lot just from even having this, from sort of doing a little bit of research before this conversation. So people who are taking like a vegan multi, for example, probably you might need to consider that you're actually taking a B12 separate supplement with that as well.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to cross reactivity and absorbability as well.
Yeah.
And I guess on that note, what type of B12 do you typically recommend?
So the one where all of the research has been done is on cyanocobalamin, which is sort of the manufactured form, and it's converted in the body to the active forms of B12. So unfortunately what's happened is that everyone's gone in the direction of thinking that methyl cobalamin is the best thing, and so most supplements will be methylcobalamin. It's probably going to be okay, but again, it's one of these situations where the research isn't quite caught up with us, so we don't know. So there's two active forms, as I understand it, sort of but you probably can say it better than I can.
But there's cyanocob. Oh, sorry. Do you mean of the supplements?
Of the active forms in the body, so it's adenylcobalamin or something like that. Yeah,
Yeah, it's tricky to remember. Lots of syllables.
yeah. Um, and so there's those two forms, the A form and the M form or whatever. And so if you're taking methylcobalamin, the question then becomes, does that actually get converted to the adenylcobalamin or whatever it is? Sorry, guys. But so probably, but we don't know that from research. So most of the information we have at the moment is that the best thing to do is to take the cyanocobalamin. Now, the issue with that, of course, is that that has cyanide in it. And apparently it's not physiologically important for most people, but you might be able to comment on this because apparently for people that have got chronic kidney disease, for example, that wouldn't be the first cab off the rank. You'd want to use the hydroxycobalamin instead.
That's a good point, actually. Yeah, I think that is what we typically use in renal
Yeah.
disease. I hadn't actually thought it through to realise that that was the rationale.
No. Yeah, it's interesting because it's at the same time, it's like apparently you get similar amounts of cyanide in things like almonds and, various other, fruits and vegetables that you might eat anyway. So it's pretty, it seems pretty irrelevant.
It's naturally occurring in some foods too.
Exactly.
And yeah, just to go back a step, for people who may not be quite so familiar with why this is relevant for people with kidney disease, the kidney is sort of like one of the main filters of the body. So if you have kidney troubles, your kidneys aren't filtering as well as they should, then things like the cyanide can stay around in your system for a little bit longer. So that's why we recommend specific supplements for people with kidney issues. And yeah, so it's quite a different protocol that we'd use than for people who are well. Yeah, I totally would agree with you on that as well, Luke. With the cyanocobalamin, like there's definitely a lot more research on that. And I think with the other consideration with like methylcobalamin versus cyano is that cyanocobalamin is a lot more shelf stable. So the methylcobalamin, if it's sitting on your shelf for a while, we're not sure if it's still useful. The research sort of shows that it tends to degrade a lot quicker than cyanocobalamin. And so for that reason, you also, if you choose to go down the pathway with the methyl cobalamin, you would also need to increase your dose quite considerably to account for that.
Yeah, it's complicated stuff. This is like...
Yeah, I think it is also, I mean, we could say this about every aspect of science, but I think it's such a young area, and I'm sure we will know more and more as the years go by, and especially as we have more people adopting a plant-based diet. I think that is definitely shifting the research in this direction. It's stacking it it's stacking it for learning more about things that are relevant to plant-based diets, and I've seen that in my work at the hospital as well, and with kidney disease, is that so much more research and funding is being channeled into these things because more and more people are choosing a plant-based diet.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so we've kind of agreed that cyanocobalamin is the way to go. Is there a dosage that you recommend, or I can share what my thoughts are on that as well?
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what you have come to for that. It's again, I kind of think, well, what I usually say to my patients is the retesting is the most important thing, to kind of see that you're getting that dose right, but anywhere like at least 50 microgram of cyanocobalamin a day. I've said in the past, like maybe 100, just to err on the side of caution, because it's really, like we were talking about earlier, there's really no side effects from taking too much. So why not just, kind of err on the side of perhaps taking a little bit too much. So maybe 100 or 200. Again, it's probably going to differ depending on what stage of life people are at as well. So you can probably comment more on that. You know, the lazy way of doing it, which admittedly I do, and you know, even after having this conversation and things and looking into it a little bit more, maybe I'll change up what I do a little bit as well, is just taking a decent dose like once a week. So that's usually what I'll do. And I think my supplement that I take is about 3,000 micrograms. And I've covered all my bases because the one that I have has hydroxo and then the two active forms as well. So it's a tricobalamin supplement. But again, I should probably be getting a cyanocobalamin and just going with that. I don't know.
It's a B12 cocktail.
It is. It actually is, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so at least 2,500 once a week, I'd say. And then, you know, daily, probably you'd be all right with 50. But what do you think about that? Is that lower than you'd be comfortable with?
Yeah, I think it would depend on sort of what you're seeing, one in your blood results, and just in medical history as well, how old you are, that sort of thing. So I typically recommend for a daily supplement somewhere between 50 and 500 micrograms, just depending on what risk factors you have and what your bloods are showing. Like if you are in that sort of borderline range, there is merit in sort of going for that higher end with the hope to sort of bring your B12 up. If the levels have been really good, been really stable, within an acceptable range, then I would agree, like probably 50 is adequate. But I think it's still absolutely worth taking to make sure that you are maintaining it in that level as well.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah, and with the B12 supplements, like if you can take ones that are sort of drops or like chewables, they're better absorbed as well. As with B12, we don't typically get big whacks of it in our food, so it's quite difficult to sort of absorb it all in one go. So having like a drop, a liquid form or a chewable just helps to enhance your absorption of the supplement. So if that is possible, I definitely recommend going with that.
Yeah, and the other thing too that we should point out as well is like the recommended daily intake of it is so much lower than the supplement, but the reason for that is because we don't absorb nearly as much as, you know, the higher the dose is, basically the less you absorb of it. So they think that our B12 receptors can handle about maybe 1.5 microgram at a time. So that's the other thing too, your timing of your doses makes a difference. If you took 50 twice a day, then you would be absorbing more, I think, than if you took you know, a higher amount just once a day. And so if I'm taking 2,500 once a week or 3,000 once a week, it doesn't end up being quite as much as you think it does. So it's 1.5 microgram, and then about 1% of whatever the rest of the dose is, apparently.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And again, like there are various like conditions that can influence your B12 absorption as well. Like for example, like if you like for people who are a bit older, you may not have that same capacity for absorption. So sort of going for say that 500 end, and I was quite surprised actually reading that about the recommendation for people over 50. I would have thought it would be quite a bit older than 50 where we need to increase that, but if you're sort of around 50 plus, there is likely some benefit from actually aiming a little bit higher with your B12 supplements.
Definitely.
And I totally agree with the RDI, like it's 2.4 micrograms, I believe. And because we're taking it in a supplemental form, the absorption's different. So you do need to go shoot a bit higher with your vitamin B12. But there are ways that you can also support your supplements through what you're eating as well. So some foods are actually fortified with vitamin B12. The particular foods that sort of jump to mind are things like yeast products, like the savoury yeast flakes. They have sort of almost like a cheesy flavour. You can sort of sprinkle them over pastas or even on top of stir fries and things like that as well. And also some of the plant-based milks are now fortified with vitamin B12. So the So Good soy milk essentials has vitamin B12 in it, so that's a really good way to just sort of support your supplements through what you're eating as well. And weirdly enough, with your yeast-based spreads, the low sodium Vegemite has vitamin B12, and it's actually not listed on the regular Vegemite. So going for the low salt one, you're actually likely to get a bit more B12. Who would have thought?
Yeah, and Marmite has it as well. Marmite always has it, I think, the B12, but yeah, not necessarily the Vegemite, which is kind of weird.
Yeah. So
And some breakfast cereals have it as well. It's just, yeah, it just depends.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
Not good to rely on that for getting what you need. But like you said, it can be an additional.
When you consider like what the consequences of running low are, that 50 microgram supplement definitely sounds a lot more attractive.
Yeah.
And again, like with the supplements as well, what I sometimes suggest to people is shooting a little bit higher, knowing that there are always going to be days when you forget to take your supplements.
Yeah.
So if you're relying on the 50 end, if you're forgetting your supplements, say 2-3 times a week, that could actually mean that you still run into trouble. So if you know that about yourself, then sort of shooting a bit higher, and this is definitely what I do. I'm terrible at taking things on a daily basis. Making sure that, you shoot a bit higher if you know that there's that possibility that you may not take them on certain days.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah.
Gosh,
so,
we've gone a bit longer than we thought we were going to, eh?
We said we'd have a chat for about 15 minutes, and I don't know how long we've been, but it's been a really great chat, and I think we've covered such a broad range of aspects of vitamin B12, and I think it's a really important conversation to be having. So thank you so much, Luke, for joining me today and for sharing your expertise. It's been really valuable, not just for the people who have tuned in, but for me as well. I find every time we have a conversation like this, I learn things from you. So thank you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time out of your Sunday to come and join me today.
All good.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining as well. If you have any questions, I'll stay on for maybe another couple of minutes to hopefully answer any of those. But otherwise, thank you all for tuning in and also taking the time out on your Sunday for this important conversation. And you're welcome to flick me a DM as well if you have any questions as well.